Amen. At the beginning of this month, the beginning of this year, I should say, we opened with the idea of having some goals for 2024. And one of those goals was to build better relationships. And the question is, how do we do that? How do we build better relationships with one another, with our community, especially with God? And we find here Paul answering that question with some very good specific steps in 1 Thessalonians 4, 11, and 12. And what we have here is really there's an exhortation, an explanation, and we'll tie in some applications. So let's take a look here at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. It says, "And to make your ambition to lead a quiet life, and to attend to your own business, and to work with your own hands, just as we commanded you, so that you will behave properly toward outsiders and not be in any need." And we'll stop right there because there's really quite a bit taking shape. Paul has this exhortation he opens with here. It's a goal. When he says, make it your ambition. This is, he's setting a target, if you would. And that's something that I believe we need to do as followers of Christ, is to have various goals that we strive for. And this is one of them. And that is to attain a sense of virtue. Now, when we mention the idea of virtues here, that's what we find here is 3 virtues, or virtuous living. That would be something of high moral standard or conduct, how you need to behave and what your life needs to look like. And he lists them here. Number 1, to lead a quiet life. Number 2, to mind your own business, to take care of matters, and ultimately there to work, and he says, with your own hands. When he says to lead a quiet life, this idea of leading a quiet or peaceful life is to be calm, to be restful, to approach life with a sense of tranquility. And what we find here, reflected in Psalm 46, the essence of what Paul is saying: be still and know that I am God. The notion here of tranquility is not to be stirring up commotion. And this could be among others. You've seen it. I've seen it. We've seen it. There's that person out there that just loves to stir the pot. They love to shoot off their mouth. They love to step in and meddle with other people's business. And this is exactly what Paul is saying you shouldn't be doing. The Proverbs make it clear that we need to just watch how we interface with other people. It says this: "Let your foot rarely be in your neighbor's house, or he'll become weary of you and hate you." In the words of Benjamin Franklin, what do fishing guests have in common? And after 3 days, they start to smell. And this is kind of the idea that's being conveyed here. Not stirring up a bunch of commotion, not making a pain in the neck out of yourself. The second has to do with not creating panic all the time. The notion of being tranquil or being peaceful people carries with it not just on a social level, but how you interact with things. Are you always pushing the panic button? Are you chicken little on steroids? That type of picture here where, everything is the end of the world. The minute you have a hangnail or the minute you see something in the news that doesn't go your way, you're in a complete tizzy because you're all worked up about it. And it tells us in Philippians to do just the opposite. He says, be anxious for nothing. There was I was in the accident. This was several years ago. A group of us were traveling down the interstate. This is in southern Vermont. It was in the middle of winter. The temperature was right around 32 degrees. And we were on one of those real long stretches of hill coming down. And the roads were there was like a spit, like there was just a little bit of precipitation. Sometimes it was snow. Sometimes it was a little rain and ice and all this other garbage in between. And the roads were a little slippery. And we were coming down a long hill, and you saw way at the bottom of the hill, it could have been probably at least 3/4 of a mile away, there was some sort of an accident at the bottom of the hill. Somebody had slid off the side. So everyone basically was in the slow lane, moving down relatively slow down this hill. There was probably about 6 or 7 cars descending down the hill. And as we were getting closer and closer, we realized everybody needed to stop. So as we were slowly coming to a stop, all these cars in this long line, this tractor trailer comes booking over the hill in the fast lane, and it was just a tractor trailer with a big flatbed, nothing on it. And the guy goes flying down the hill, and he realizes everybody's stopping, and he needs to stop. So the guy slams on his brakes, and as he's slamming on his brakes, going down the slippery hill, the back of his trailer starts to catch every one of the cars on the way down. And you hear, ba-boom, it was like dominoes, ba-boom, 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 and everybody got smacked. And we all got pushed off to the side of the road. And he finally came to a stop. And some people are flipping out. And nobody, thank God, nobody was seriously hurt. But there was this one guy, he hopped out of his car, and he's completely calm. And he just went from car to car. Hey, you all right? Everything good? Okay, thank God we can replace cars, we can't replace people. And that's what he said. Every car he went to, he just went down. He said, hey, everything's under control. That's the picture of what God is speaking about here. Being under pressure, being slammed with some of the problems of life, which all of us go through, but having that sense of tranquility, not being anxious as we go through our daily routine. That's the quiet life. That's what Paul's saying here. Number 2, he says, mind your own business here, to practice good habits, to be consistent in how you live. Colossians punctuates this very nicely. It says in Colossians 3:23, whatever you do your work heartily as to the Lord rather than for men. So in other words, we're not just necessarily serving our families, we're not just serving our church, we're not just serving our kids, we're not just serving our community, we're serving God. And with that comes a sense of consistency. We want to be faithful in what we put our hand to. And that comes to everything. This picture here is someone who just takes care of business, and it starts with yourself. Brushing your teeth and making your bed and showering and just being somewhat presentable when you step out into public, taking care of business there, taking care of your home, mowing your lawn and making sure your dishes are put away and the like, going out and taking care of relationships and being attentive to your children and not just letting them run amok, and being attentive to your marriage. And how many times do you hear about people, they get married and then the honeymoon is over, and then 2 years later they haven't been on a date in months, and it's like, neglecting relationships. It's picking up the phone and saying, hey, I want to call my cousins, my friends, and maintaining good rapport with people. That's the picture of what's taking shape here. It carries with it the idea of being mindful of the responsibilities that God has put in front of you, whether it be to your own, self-hygiene, to your home, to your family, at work, making sure, things look good in terms of just your desk isn't always looking like a bomb hit it, that type of thing. It's just minding the business that God has put in front of you and being responsible for that. And what we find here is that it's not just an issue of these personal habits, it's also collectively. It's being involved with church and community and being a contributor there. And what happens is that creates a witness in terms of how we manage life. I'll give you an example of a contrast here. When we lived in Texas, I had a doctor in our hometown, and he was a brilliant guy. I mean, he diagnosed things very well. He was compassionate. He asked all the right questions. He was someone that if you walked in there, you thought to yourself, that guy just knows medicine well. When we moved here to Vermont, had another doctor, same thing. Very knowledgeable, very articulate, very kind, compassionate, asked all the right questions. He knew medicine well. My doctor in Texas, I struggled with. My doctor in Vermont, I trusted. Same character. But the difference between these two men was my doctor in Texas literally was one cheeseburger away from a cardiac arrest. It was sad. He was just a couple of years older than me. And every time I walked into the office, I would take a look at this guy and I'm like, dude, you're a disaster. Something's going to happen here. And it was sad. I'm not trying to be pejorative. I'm not trying to cut the guy down, but it was a sad scenario when you walked into his office. He had all the right attributes, but he didn't live it out. When I got here to Vermont, my doctor here, same attributes in terms of a physician, but he was out, cross-country skiing all winter long. He had a bike. He was on the trail. One day he sat down and says, I sometimes, gain a couple extra pounds, and, here's my diet. He told me what he ate for lunch. And he's like, this is something that, you want to think about in terms of, good eating habits. And I found him to be much more easy to listen to. Why? Because he lived it. And this is what we find Paul saying here. Develop good habits. Be consistent. Practice what you preach. The third point is this idea of working here. Mind your business and to work with your hands. Now, this was something radical, really, for the Thessalonians to hear. And the reason why it was radical is because the Greeks approached manual labor very differently than the Jews. In Greek culture, any manual labor was poo-pooed upon. It was disdained. It was belittling. And they didn't want to embrace it. This is why you had slaves. This is why you had servants. You never got your hands dirty. You never rolled up your sleeves. You never got out there with a shovel or a hammer, did anything. That's what you brought in the servants to do. And in Greek culture, this was considered to be subpar. The Jews, on the other hand, and Paul's coming at this from a very Jewish perspective, held work in very high esteem, especially manual labor. In fact, if you came from a wealthy family, let's say you didn't even have to work in Jewish culture. Let's say you had a huge farm, and you had an estate, and you had lots of servants and income coming in that kept everything going. Jewish parents still insisted that you learn a trade because you never know when those riches may not be there. They insisted that you learn how to either be a carpenter or do agriculture, farm, be a tent maker, be a shipbuilder, be a potter or something like that. They always saw to it that their family had the tools, the equipping of some form of a skill so that they could go out, if need be, and earn a living. And this is precisely what Paul is saying to the Thessalonians. They're dealing actually with an issue of laziness. It's a problem with them. And we'll find that more so in the next epistle as Paul deals with it head on. But he starts here with saying you need to be mindful of the fact that riches are fleeting and we need to have a skill set to fall back on if need be so that we could go out and earn a living. And this is the advice he passes on to them. Laziness was an issue. It's been an issue since the beginning of time. But let's take a look here at what he is confronting. Proverbs 24, 30 through 34. I passed by the field of a sluggard, and by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. And when I saw, I reflected upon it, and I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then your poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. Instead, what Paul is advocating for is what we find here in Proverbs 10:4. Poor is he who works with the negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes one rich. And this is what we find here. Paul is saying we need to be diligent. We need to be mindful. We need to be skilled. We need to be going out there doing things. And this is a problem in our culture today. We find that there are large numbers of people who could be working, who should be working, who need to be working, and they're not working. And it's a very sad situation. And it transcends, really, believe it or not, generation and age. A lot of times people like to rail on younger people and say, well, there's a lot of younger people who aren't working. And there's a truth to that, but there's a lot who are. In fact, believe it or not, people who are aged 20 to 44 are actually working more hours, according to the Board of Labor and Statistics, than people who are older in terms of just the number of hours being invested in the workplace. So we have young people who are working hard, but there's a group out there that aren't. We also find the same thing with people on the other end. USA Today had an article just the other day about the number of people who are retiring that are what they call late baby boomers, people born between 1960 and 65. There's a whole bunch of them that are just quitting. They don't have retirement, they don't have savings. They're just deciding they're checking out and they're going to do something else for a while. And it's like, what's up with that? There's something slipping through the cracks here. And at the end of the day, what we're finding here is that Paul is exhorting us to be diligent in working. Whatever God has put in front of us to do. And there's some wisdom behind this, to acquire those skills. If you're a parent or a grandparent, I highly exhort you to teach children and grandchildren, not to just have one set of skills, but a whole separate skill set that could be marketable. And I bring this up as a practical piece of advice because it's exactly what my grandfather told me when I was in high school. When I wanted to go to college, I wanted to start a business, I wanted to go off and do something different. And he's like, you need to learn something because you need a fallback plan. I'm like, what are you talking about? Here I'm like 15 years old. What do you know? And he's like, no, you need a fallback in case something doesn't work. You can go off to school, you may get a job, the economy could tank, you could lose your job, the business could go under. You need a backup plan. Here's a hammer, son. And he handed me this hammer, and we ended up doing some construction work together. I learned a few skills. I'm not a master carpenter by any stretch of the imagination, but what was amazing was when I got into college, I got a job with a guy who was a carpenter, and I found myself making triple what my friends were making. I got a job on a construction crew that was doing commercial projects. I was making literally 3 times what most of my buddies were making at that same time. Like, Grandpa was right. He had a point here. And it was good to know there was always a fallback, even though I was heading in a different direction with a career. But what we have here, and what the scriptures are explaining to us, is that we need to be diligent about work because it's part of our witness. And the picture that Solomon paints in Proverbs really is quite good, because this is where it leads. Wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but the one who gathers by labor increases it. This is what we call the little by little concept. Paul wants to see the Thessalonians earning their bread, paying their bills, putting a little aside for a rainy day, and building a store, a nest egg, because he understands that tough times will come and they need to be diligent, be responsible, and be peaceful. Years ago, I was listening to a radio show, and they were interviewing a guy. He had retired. He was a custodian. He was a millionaire. And the guy who was interviewing was like, how did you become a millionaire being a custodian for a local school? And this fellow said, it was pretty simple. I graduated high school, didn't do too well. I had terrible grades. Didn't know what to do with my life, so I went out, I enlisted in the Army, I served for 4 years, came back, didn't have any aspiration to go off to college or anything, but I found a job at a local public school, just basically being a custodian. And he's like, well, you didn't make, he didn't get a lot of, his paycheck was very, very low. And the guy was like, I basically did a couple things. Number one, I lived within my means. I never borrowed money. The only time I had a mortgage borrowed anything was for a house, and I paid it off as quick as I could. So I never went into debt, and I was content with what I had. If I made $20,000 a year, I only spent $19,000. So I always saved, and that's what I did. I lived with what I had. I put a little bit aside, and by the time the guy was 62, he had over $1 million saved, and his house was paid off. Little by little. This is what Paul is saying here, to create a nest egg, to have a sense of financial independence whereby you're not relying upon others all the time. And he's trying to get them to think differently about how they approach life. So what we find here, he gives them this charge, but what we have here is our first point, very simple. Cultivate godly virtues. If we want to build better relationships, we want to cultivate godly virtues. Peace. To be a person of peace. Responsibility and diligence. This is the foundation that Paul is establishing. If we put these virtues into practice, we will find something very unique will unfold. And that's really what we find in the second verse. It tells us here, if you're virtuous like this, you will what? Excuse me. So that your daily life, he says, may win the respect of outsiders, and that you will not be dependent upon anyone. That so that in Greek is, here's why. It's the explanation. So the explanation, there's really 2 things that come out of all this. Respect and a sense of independence. This is part of their witness. This is how they're going to present the gospel. By virtue of living a virtuous life, that would set the stage whereby people will see life change, transformation, peace, diligence, responsibility. These are respectful traits. And folk would take notice of this, especially in that culture that was going in the totally opposite direction. And now they would stand out. This was part of how they would represent Christ. It would open the door for witnessing and sharing the gospel, that Jesus loves them. He died on a cross. He rose from the grave. He is offering forgiveness. He's offering eternal life to those who would believe. And this was the way in which they would connect by virtue of building good community relations. Because people would see that they are just dependable people, responsible people, peaceful people. That their speech would be gracious and that they would be considerate of how they interface with other folk. Listen to what Proverbs 16:24 says. Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. If we're a person of peace, if we're a person of diligence, if we're a person who is being responsible, we're thinking about how our words affect other people. It's part of our witness. You've seen it. Everyone, if you ever go to a Little League game or soccer game, there's that one parent. They're out there. And somebody makes a mistake. And they're screaming, and they're yelling, and they're waving their fists, and they're telling the umpire what to do, and they're telling the coach what to do, and they're telling the kids what to do from the sideline. And there's some days I wish I want to stand up and say, you want it done better? Coach them yourself. What do but you see that all the time. And what is it? It's just repulsive. And this is what Paul is speaking to here. When we're being diligent, when we're being responsible, when we're being mindful, we're being respectful, and people see that in contrast to the big mouth at the Little League game. When I was in Boy Scouts, our scoutmaster, sadly, not long after I finished up, had passed away of a heart attack. He had a massive shutdown, and that was it. And the community, after he had passed away, dedicated a hiking trail in the town to this guy because he was respectful. He was vested. He was responsible. He had invested himself into the community to such a degree that people had seen his work and had recognized that he had been a positive contributor to their children. And they wanted to honor him because they felt that his efforts were so laudable. So they put a big old plaque by this hiking trail and dedicated to him. And this is sort of what Paul is getting at here in this passage, is that when we're living lives of diligence and responsibility, that folk will take notice. That doesn't mean you're going to win every popularity contest. That doesn't mean people are going to be flocking to your house saying, hey, how do I get saved? And tell me about Jesus Christ. But what you're doing is you're setting the stage. And that's what we find here. So we find here that there will be respect that will be earned. And there will also be the witness of a sense of self-sufficiency. We become contributors, not takers. And I believe that's part of our witness as well. It tells us that you will not be dependent upon anyone. And this is something that I think is a very critical, practical, financial lesson that Paul is putting out there to the Thessalonians. Watch out with your spending. Watch out with the debt. Watch out with how you live your lives. Because when we become unequally yoked with the world, they could start pulling the strings in terms of how we live our lives as a church community. Listen to what the scripture says about this topic, about independence. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. So this is living within our means. And it goes on to say, Proverbs 22, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Debt has been a problem since the beginning of time. And when Paul is talking about this sense of independence, he is speaking here specifically to finances. And one of the reasons why we as a church have a no debt policy is that we don't want to fall into that trap of becoming a servant to the lender. And many of you know what that looks like. When we rack up bills upon bills, the interest starts to pile up. And now all of a sudden we're working more and more. The house that cost $100,000 is now going to cost you $200,000. And it gets worse and worse as time goes on. So what we find here is this notion of living in the means, watching out for the debt, being very careful of the bondage that can ensue. He also is speaking here about unhealthy dependency This happens within families. It's one of the first things when I do premarital counseling, one of the issues I always bring up with couples is, do you have any apron strings attached to mom and dad that are financial? Because suddenly, you could have a lot of problems in a marriage when you have that unhealthy level of dependency. We've got to be careful of that. It's one of the other reasons why we don't do fundraisers as a church. We don't go out and sell stuff. We're not peddling things on the street. We don't have candy bars and Christmas trees and all those other things. Why? Because we're in the business of giving grace. We're in the business of reaching out. We're in the business of showing people the love of Christ, not always asking them for the handout and having that unhealthy level of dependency. That's what we're finding here and what fuels how we operate as a congregation. And here we see the second, what comes of this is that a generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. And that's what we're looking to be, is a generous people. Because in the end, this is what happens. A good name is to be more desired than great wealth. Favor is better than silver or gold. Point number 2 is this: virtue builds rapport. That's what Paul's getting at here. It builds rapport. When we are virtuous, we find that we eliminate some of the contention that exists, and we create a platform for our Christian witness. Let me give you a quick picture of what this looks like, and we'll wrap things up. Actually, it's in twofold. I knew a fellow down in Texas. He worked in this little factory. Started right after he graduated high school. Spent his entire career there. Took care of work, took care of his home, took care of his family, took care of his children, took care of his yard, took care of everything he did when he went to work. He slowly ascended up the ranks, and he became noticed because he was a responsible guy. What did that lead to? He was attending an enormous church. A lot of heavy hitters in terms of people with PhDs and a variety of business backgrounds. Guess who was one of the lead elders of that congregation? This fella. Why? Because he led a virtuous life. And everybody noticed it. Whatever he put his hand to, he took care of. He was peaceful, he was diligent, he was respectful, and you couldn't help but see it in his witness. And that opened up door after door after door. He was the guy you wanted on your board. Because he was an individual who showed personal responsibility. I'll give you another picture of this on a congregational level. When I was growing up, we lived up on this hill. At the bottom of the hill, about 3/4 of a mile away, there was a church plant. It was a home and a pastor with a bunch of kids and a Bible study. That's all it was. And there was maybe a handful of families that were coming to this thing. Less than 20 people were involved with this church plant. Over the years, that church worked hard, invested in one another's lives. They took care of their families, their parents, their children. They were diligent about how they operated. They were responsible people. They ended up buying a small piece of land right nearby at the bottom of the hill. They paid for it in cash. They put a little sign out that this is going to be the future home of the church. And for years they kept on saving and working on it. And then they built that church with their own hands. They went out there, and it was just a little box. That's all it was. It was like half the size of this room. There was this tiny box that they built on this piece of property, but they paid for it in cash. And as soon as they opened up that church, it took them a few years to do it. As soon as it became a community outreach, they never were asking people, hey, build us a new boiler or donate to the kitchen or anything. No, they left that out. They wanted that little box to be a blessing to the community, and they ended up, they didn't have much money. They put a few picnic tables behind in the grass, and they had a volleyball court. And they said, anybody in the community who wants to play volleyball, you come on by. You can come here and play volleyball and hang out and use this as a resource. As soon as the doors were open, they turned it into a meal center for seniors. They had Meals on Wheels coming in. They allowed people to come in and be part of that. They were reaching out. They had the local nursing home. They wanted to connect with that. Somebody had an extra piano when they were looking to furnish the church. One piano was donated, and another person had a spare piano and said, let's be a blessing to the community. They gave it to the local nursing home, and then they started having services up there. And every Sunday afternoon, they'd go up for about 30 minutes, play some old-time hymns, do a 10-minute devotion. They loved it. Every time they turned around, they were what? They were interfacing with their community with peace and diligence and responsibility. The pastor of that church every graduation in high school was asked to speak. Every single year. He was the one who opened with the invocation, the benediction, and they gave him about a 2 to 3 minute spot to say a couple of words to the students every single year. He would do a proverb very often, give them a little bit of, a nugget of wisdom he would drop in their laps at graduation. He was at my graduation. I still remember the guy. He was fantastic. Why was he given that opportunity to be a witness to the community? Because they built rapport. Even if you didn't agree with them, even if you didn't even like them, people respected that church because they were about community. They were about relationships. They were about giving and being generous. That's why they had such a high impact. And they're still there today. They're still ministering to people. It's a wonderful witness in a part of the world that not a lot of people are saved. Why? Because they've learned to put this simple set of virtues into practice. Jesus said it this way: all men, not just those sitting in a pew, all men will know you're my disciples if you love one another. And this is what it looks like. So we want to be peaceful, we want to be diligent, we want to be responsible, because virtue builds rapport. And that's how we get better relationships. Let's pray. Father, we thank you.